Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 12 and don't worry if you haven't seen any of the other videos so far in this series. I will link a playlist at the top of the screen so that you can go back and catch up if you want to. This year we're making a quilt and we're taking a garden theme, and each week we make some blocks to put together into a finished quilt topper, and later on in the year we will quilt it and finish our final heirloom piece. Now this week we're going to do something a little bit different. We're not going to make a single block. We're going to use some of our pattern fabrics to make some spacer blocks. Now these are really important for the finished look of our quilt. We're making some really busy, detailed blocks using all sorts of textile art techniques, and what we want is some balance in our finished quilt. So we want to create some blocks where the eye could just rest and that offer a little bit of space and a little bit of stillness across the surface of our quilt. So I've got three fabrics here. My first one is my Ladybird fabric. It's got quite a lot of the colours that are featuring through our quilt. We've got our red, we've got the yellow and white, and we've got those earthy greens. My second fabric is the fabric that has inspired the colour scheme of my quilt. So this is my bug fabric, and we used this back in week 2 when we did our kitchen window quilt. We cut out some of the motifs and turned them into little window panes, and I absolutely love this fabric. So I'm looking forward to using that. And the third fabric we've got is our Random Spot, and we used this a couple of weeks ago when we paired up a second block with our Scrappy Flowers block that we made in week 1, and this is cropping up here and there across the quilt, and it's going to add a lovely pop of bright colour. I've also got some embroidery threads. I just got a few out, so I've got my white, which is 001, these are all Anchor brand. I've got my yellow, which is 298, my red, which is 46, and my blue, which is 130. And I do use a couple of other colours later on, so I'm going to use my dark green, which is 258, and my bright green, which is 255. I've also got some trims here. I've got some really nice chunky white rickrack, and I just love the texture that rickrack offers. And I've also got a couple of grosgrain ribbons, and these are Celebrate brand. You can get these at Hobbycraft or The Range, or most craft shops sell them. And this is a grosgrain ribbon. If I just angle it, you might be able to see those lines that cross the ribbon. Gives it a lovely texture, and both of these have got a stitched detail along the edge, and we're going to use that stitch detail to add some stitching of our own this week. So I've got both of those, and then finally I've got my blue lace trim, and I just happened to find this at Hobbycraft. It's a Trimmets brand. If you're interested in getting something similar, I've just got the code on the screen there, so you can track it down in your local craft store. I've got my embroidery scissors here, I've got some pins just off camera, and I've got a range of marking tools today. So I've got my heat erase pens, but I also want a marking tool that isn't going to fade over time. Now I haven't tested out my water erase pen, and I suspect that it will just vanish just because of moisture in the air, and I want something more permanent, so I'm probably going to use my pencil later on to do some marking. And the last tool I've got is my grid ruler. So this is based around centimetres. Each little square is a ½ centimetre, and that's going to help me with my measuring. So that's our basic equipment, and I think I'm going to start with the Ladybird fabric because that's the one that matches my nails, and I just want to choose a ribbon trim that's going to work with it, and I think out of the two I prefer the green, so that's the one that I'm going to work with. So we're going to create a line of ribbon across this panel, and I want to measure up from the bottom of my block 7 centimetres. Now my ruler is only 5 centimetres wide, so I have to measure this. but I'm just putting a little mark on the left and a mark on the right, and then I'm just going to join those two up. And you'll notice that I'm making small movements with my pen because I don't just want to drag my pen right across the fabric. If I do that, I'll end up with some distortion. I'm going to pin my ribbon so that the bottom of the ribbon is sitting on the line, and just like we normally do, I want to pin from left to right. If we pin both ends first, we run the risk of capturing lumps and bumps into our ribbon. So I want to smooth from left to right while I'm putting in my pins, just to hold my ribbon in place while I stitch it down. I've threaded up a single strand of my green thread. This is Anchor 258 and it's a really good match with the colour of the ribbon, so hopefully these stitches will be invisible. And I've brought my needle up through both layers of fabric, the ribbon and the backing fabric, just inside the ribbon there. I'm going to tuck my needle in right up against the edge of the ribbon and take my needle back through just the backing fabric. So we're doing an applique stitch here to hold our ribbon down. We're trying to create invisible stitches, so I come up through both layers just into the ribbon, and then tucking my needle right in close, I go back down through just the backing fabric, and you can barely see those stitches there so that they don't become a feature. So again, up through both layers and down through just the backing fabric. And once you've got started, you can do this in a rocking motion. So I'm just keeping my needle tucked really close into the ribbon, and rather than doing it in two motions, I'm just rocking forward onto the ribbon just to put my next applique stitch in there. I do find it helpful to remove the pins as I go, just to make sure that I'm keeping my ribbon really flat as I'm stitching. And I'm going to work all the way along one side of the ribbon, and then I'm going to come back down on the other side so it's held down on both edges. So now our ribbon is attached and it's looking nice and straight, and I can now trim off the excess. So I'm just going to take my scissors and snip so that the blades of my scissors are lined up with the edge of the backing fabric block, and that just saves us having these tabs sticking out for us to manoeuvre our thread around. So it just gives a nice finish, and it also gives you a sense of what that block will look like. Now I will keep the ribbon ends, you never know when you're going to need a really tiny piece of fabric, so that will go in my scraps box. Now we're going to make use of the stitched edges of this ribbon, and I want to pick out some of the colours in the fabric. So I've picked out the yellow from the centre of the daisies, and I've got two strands here threaded into my needle, and I've just knotted the end. And what we're going to do is treat these running stitches as though we put them there, and we're going to do some laced stitching. So I'm just going to bring my thread through from the back just into the seam allowance. So we will have a 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way around the outside of this block, and I just want my stitching to start inside that seam allowance so that the end of the thread will be really secure once we've put the blocks together. And now I'm going to take the eye end of my needle underneath that first stitch on the ribbon, and I'm going to take my needle right the way across and come out through underneath the stitch below it or opposite it on the ribbon. Then I'm going to miss a pair of stitches, and I'm going to go back through the way that I came, 2 stitches along. So I'm taking my needle underneath that stitch, over the ribbon and underneath the stitch opposite it. So we're creating a laced running stitch here, but the running stitches are provided for us. So I've got a sort of loop at the end there, and then that bar crossing over the ribbon. So again, I'm missing a pair of stitches and then going under the next but 1 stitch along. So sometimes you need to manoeuvre it a little bit. I've got quite a chunky needle here so that you can see it on camera, but it does make this quite tricky. If you use a finer needle, it will be much easier. and I'm just zigzagging my way along there. So I'm going left to right, and then back right to left, and then left to right, and then back right to left. And I'm just going to work all the way along the ribbon like this. There's a huge range of stitches that you could use to lace your stitch edge ribbon with. You could use a herringbone stitch, you could do cross stitches, you could do a zigzag. This is just one idea, so you can play around and choose whatever stitch design you like. When you get to the end, just take your needle back through to the back of the fabric inside what will be the seam allowance, so just make sure you're less than 1 centimetre away from the edge of your block. And I'm just going to take my needle back through there and secure it on the back. Now my stitch edge ribbon has just come loose there, but I just am catching down that white stitching from the ribbon underneath my yellow thread. So now I'm going to come back the other way with some white thread. So I've got 2 strands of white threaded into my needle here, and again I've knotted the end, and I want to find those stitches that I missed. So I'm just going to, it's always tricky on the first one because that loop isn't caught under anything next to it, so it's sitting at a funny angle, but if you just move your yellow thread out of the way, you'll be able to find that stitch. And I'm just going to go through those 2 stitches across the ribbon with my white thread, and then I'm going to find the next pair of empty stitches and I'm going to go under that. So I'm always looking for the stitches that are inside the loops on the yellow, and that'll make sure that I've got the right stitch. And so I'm just going to work all the way along, and when we get to the end we get that nice little arrangement. We've sort of embellished our ribbon and made it look a little bit more interesting. So that's our first block. Now our second block we are going to prepare for quilting. So this one will be quilted in a sort of diagonal diamond pattern when we finish the quilt. So we're just going to mark it today to get it ready for that process. So I want to mark a line 6 centimetres down from the top of the block and 6 centimetres up from the bottom. And again I can use my heat erase pen for this because I don't need this to be permanent, I just need it for setting up. So I'm going to join up those lines. So I've got 2 lines dividing my block into 3. Now I've lined up my ruler across the diagonal corners there, and I've got my pencil and I'm just going to mark that diagonal line. So I'm going from the top left corner down to the first line, and then the second line down to the bottom right corner, and that's going to give me my starting angle to work with. And I'm doing this in pencil because these are lines that I need to remain on my fabric right up until the end of the year when we come to quilt it. Now I'm going to put in lines that are 2.5 centimetres apart from each other. So this is where my grid ruler comes in really handy, and I'm lining up the 2.5 centimetre line, this one here, with the pencil line that I've just drawn, and then I can sketch in my next line. And I'm only marking the top and bottom sections. I don't want any pencil marks in the centre section. So you can see those 2 lines there just about. And then I line up my 2.5 centimetre line again and move across. So then I can turn around my block and fill in the lines to the left at the bottom. So I've put in all my lines going this way. I now want to do the opposite diagonal. So I find it much easier to turn my block. So I am going from the top right corner of the quilt block here, as it will be the right way up, down to the bottom left. So these are creating crosses. I've just rotated my fabric 90 degrees to the left. So I'm putting in that first diagonal across the corner, and then we're going to repeat that process. So again, making sure I'm using my 2.5 centimetre line on my ruler, and I'm just putting in all of those other diagonals, and then I've flipped my block and I can work back to fill in the spaces to the right. So hopefully you can just about see those diagonal lines there, and because it's pencil it will last until I wash it, so when I wash the quilt at the end those lines will disappear. So now I've got my lace braid, and I think this will look really nice on this block, and I want the curvy edge of the lace to be moving into that centre section. So again, I've cut 2 lines of lace that go a little bit beyond the edges of the block, and I've pinned those in place so that the straight edge of the lace trim sits on those lines. And I'm just going to do exactly the same process again. So I've got a single strand of my blue embroidery thread here, and once again I'm just going to use an applique stitch to go along that straight edge and just secure it in place, and I'm going to do that on both strips. So I've only gone along one edge. You could go along both edges if you want to, but I quite like that it lifts up, and I want to keep that, but I'm not confident that my single strand of applique stitch is going to secure that forever. Now there will be some machine stitching when we put the blocks together, so down each side there will be some machine stitching, but I also want to embellish this braid, and I thought I would do something that I don't normally use. I've got all 6 strands here. I hardly ever sew with 6 strands. I find it really troublesome. It baffles me why people don't divide their thread. Some people can do this really well. I've never really been able to, so I'm going to keep it simple. So I've threaded up all 6 strands of my green again. This is 258, and we're just going to put in a running stitch using the holes in the lace. So you can see I've got that sort of dashed line of holes along the right hand side of the lace, and I've just come up through the first hole and gone down through the second hole, and then I come up through the third hole and down through the fourth, up through the fifth, down through the sixth, and I'm just going to make that running stitch line all the way along my lace trim on both lines, and that's all we're going to do with this block. So this section here will be quilted when we come to finish up our quilt, and this middle section will be left plain, and we've just got that little bit of stitch detail where we've woven some thread in and out of the lace trim, and that's going to help secure that lace as well. It's a fail safe as well as a decorative feature. So our third block then is going to be on this red spot fabric, and for this one I thought we could get our chunky rickrack in play. Now this time I want my line to be quite close to the top, and we're going to create some tram lines here. So I'm going to start off by putting in a line that is 3 centimetres down from what will be the top of the block. So again, I've just rotated my block 90 degrees to the left, marking in my 3 centimetre line. And to get this right, I just want to measure my rickrack, and it's 1.5 centimetres from the top of one ripple to the bottom of the next one along. So I want to mark in a 1.5 centimetre line, but I also want some space either side. So what I'm going to do is line up my 2.5 centimetre line with that first line that I drew at 3 centimetres. So this line that I'm drawing is now 5.5 centimetres down from the top of the block. So I've got those tram lines there, and I'm going to measure 0.5 centimetre in from each line. So just putting in 0.5 centimetre borders, and that will leave a 1.5 centimetre space in the middle. I'm just going to put in those 2 lines. So we've got 3 centimetres, and then 3.5 centimetres, then 5 centimetres, and then 5.5 centimetres. So we've got these 2 pairs of tram lines, almost like train tracks. And once again, I'm going to cut a piece of rickrack that is just slightly wider than my block, and those inner lines are going to be how I line up my rickrack. So I want to make sure it's sort of centred on the block, and I want the top of the waves to sit on the top line and the bottom of the waves to sit on the bottom line. And again, we're going to pin from left to right to smooth it out as we go along. And now I've got a single strand of white thread, and I'm just using exactly the same technique. But there's my rickrack in place, so you can see I've just trimmed it back to the edge of the block. Now we're going to use the rickrack to add some decorative stitching, and we're going to put in some diagonal lines across our rickrack. So I'm going to start in the very bottom of the wave at the top, and I'm going to bring my needle across to the top of the wave at the bottom. So rather than thinking of the rickrack, now think about the wavy line that is created as it moves into the red. So I'm going to then come up at the bottom of that wave at the top and go back to join the stitch that I just made. So it's kind of a back stitch this, but we're doing it on diagonals, so we just want to make sure our stitches meet up. So now I'm going to come across to the top of the next wave along and go back to join the previous diagonal, and then across to the next wave and then go back to join up with the previous stitch. And we just work like this all the way along our rickrack so that we are creating effectively a zigzag. And now I want to do some stitching on these two remaining lines, and I thought I would do a cable chain stitch here because it is actually one of my favourite stitches of all time. I just love cable chain. And we start this by starting as if we were doing normal chain stitch. So I've brought my thread through, I go back down the same hole, and we rock forward and come up inside that loop that we've made. So now, instead of just making our next loop, we're going to add a step, and I'm going to put my needle underneath the thread and pull the thread underneath my needle so that I've wrapped it around, and then I take my needle back down through the fabric just a little way down from the bottom of that very first loop, and when I pull through, my next loop is created, so that creates my next chain stitch. So now I bring my needle up inside that loop and pull through, and then I'm going to take my needle underneath my thread and wrap my thread once, hold that wrap in place and take my needle back down through the fabric a little way beneath that next chain, and when I pull through, that's going to create my next loop. So it's a really simple stitch, it's only a slight variation on chain stitch, but what it creates is this set of chains that almost look like they're joined by bars, and I think it's just a lovely stitch to put in. It's really decorative. So again, I've wrapped my thread and take my needle back down, and that's created my next loop, and I come up in that loop to create my next chain. Take my needle under and wrap it over the top, and then go back down, just hold that wrap in place, go back down through the fabric a little way beneath your last chain and pull through to form your next chain loop. I do find it easier if you pull your wrap really tight against the needle before you take it back down through the fabric, but it's just a lovely decorative stitch. So I've put in 2 lines of those on my 2 remaining lines, and now they're in place. I did think that the blue on my rickrack didn't stand out as much as I'd like it to, so I thought I'd add a little bit of extra stitching. I've got 2 strands of yellow here, and I'm going to put in some verticals. So we've put in our diagonals, so this time I'm going to bring my needle up right at the base of the wave that's going down, just right at the tip of it, and I'm going to bring my needle up to the point where those blue stitches join together and just put in a vertical like that. and then I'm going to go to the top of the next wave on the outside of the rickrack and bring my needle through again and go down to where the blue stitches meet just beneath it, and I'm just going to work my way along the rickrack, putting in those little vertical stitches in yellow just to add a little bit of extra colour and detail to this block. So there really is nothing complicated here, it's very simple. And again, this is just one idea, just a really simple idea. You could do any sort of stitching on the rickrack. It's fun to play around with the wave shape. So there is my finished block. This was our second one with our quilt preparation and our threaded lace trim, and this is where we started with our ladybirds and our laced stitch edge ribbon. So there are 3 spacer blocks for this week. Very different video, playing around with trims and stitching to create some decorative details, but very simple blocks. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I'm really looking forward to seeing how you play around with braids to create some decorative finishes. Do share your creations at #FSH23quilt. I can't wait to see what you come up with. If you have enjoyed using some ribbons and trims, then I will link another video that's similar down here. I'll put a video up here that's best for you. If you'd like to subscribe, we'd be so grateful. We'd love to have you as part of our little community here. Just click on the logo down here and it makes it really easy for you. Have a great week. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.